Greetings, my name's Adam Barrington, and I'm the national organizer for Public Rail Now, a coalition of railroad workers, environmental justice activists, trackside community organizers, and others calling for the public ownership and operation of the U.S. rail system. We're proud to announce the launch of our new podcast, which we hope you will find educational, inspiring, and entertaining. For our first episode, I sat down with railroad worker Nick Wurst, the General Secretary of Railroad Workers United and member of Smart TD Local 1473, to talk about the East Palestine derailment, precision scheduled railroading, regulatory capture, and much more. For more information about the Public Rail Now campaign, please visit publicrailnow.org.
Nearly 50 cars derailed in the small town on Friday, February 3rd. While that train was heading to Conway, Pennsylvania, an immediate evacuation order followed.
This morning, the NTSB with a scathing report on the East Palestine train derailment, detailing a laundry list of failures that led to the crash and put people needlessly at risk.
Rail workers have fallen ill at the derailment site. Protests from people living near one of the waste management sites.
Absence of a fatality or injury doesn't mean the presence of safety.
I can't believe that 2 years have passed, and those have been a sort of very busy. It's been a very, very busy 3 or so years for a lot of us involved in rail labor, and so East Palestine was kind of this big event slammed in the middle of all of these other things that were going on, and I think it really changed a lot of the discussion going forward. So in case people weren't, were living under a rock or something, or they've forgotten. So what we're talking about is a massive derailment, February 3rd, 2023, in East Palestine, Ohio.
Massive derailment of a train car in East Palestine, Ohio. The train was carrying hazardous materials at the time, and tonight the NTSB says a hot rail car wheel bearing sparked a fire. Video showing the glow on the track some 20 miles away from the scene. Investigators say the crash could have been avoided.
Where a Norfolk Southern train derailed and spilled a bunch of hazardous materials all over this town. And then a lot of the aside from just the initial derailment, so much of the damage and concern for residents and people outside of East Palestine, but that live in similar towns, right, where trains are going through all the time, is sort of how they dealt with the cleanup and the aftermath of that, and the long-term health concerns and all of that stuff. So, I can talk a little bit about sort of from the technical, like, railroad side, why and how the derailment happened, and how that's connected to sort of concerns about how operations are run at some of the biggest, freight railroads in the country. If that makes sense as a place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of like, before you get into it, it was something like 16 states were in total impacted by the derailment. So it wasn't, obviously East Palestine was hit the worst, but this is something that went far beyond the borders of Ohio even. So, this is a really catastrophic event that we're talking about here.
Well, and even in like my understanding, and it's not the most up to date on all of this, but even like trucking out the contaminated soil and everything like that, and just burying it in whatever other states. If I was remembering right, in sort of like the immediate aftermath, there were news stories about how governors of other states were finding out after the fact that contaminated soil had been from the site had been trucked in and like buried in their states. So it's all, it's so much bigger than this one town and this one day.
Yeah, definitely. So for folks that might not be hip to maybe the mechanics or the technical aspects of like what what had caused the derailment. Maybe as a railroader, if you want to give some insight into, we heard all about this faulty wheel bearing that caused the derailment, and maybe like what the hell's a wheel bearing, like, and how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to get that mechanical with it, but yeah. So when this happened, I remember waking up the next day and seeing like all over social media from railroad people, texts and emails, a whole bunch of people in Railroad Workers United, sort of sharing information as it was coming out to try and like diagnose what had happened, because it was really sort of unclear at first. But I just remember seeing the photos, and I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, but I had kind of a sense of like, it was only a matter of time for something like this to happen, and kind of a sense that really this sort of whatever it turns out has actually caused this derailment. Like realistically, this derailment probably could have happened, hundreds, thousands of times, but for, one little thing, right? So what, there's a few things that we identified in sort of like the early days after the derailment as Railroad Workers United, when we were doing our best to talk to the media, talk to people directly, share information as quickly as we could about what we thought was going on, and what people should know about this, with the main aim of trying to educate sort of non-railroad workers as to what's systemic about this, right? Because I think immediately the first thing that's going to happen anytime you see any kind of accident, right, is there could be an assumption that it's somehow the crew that was at fault, right? The people who were operating the train, and of course that sort of, they've been officially cleared of that, right? But from the get-go, we were all saying that the problems with the railroads are so deep and systemic that anything that even on the surface looks like it's the fault of any kind of individual worker, there's a whole bunch of stuff that built up to that. So there were a few things that we were able to spot. One was obviously the footage of I think it was like a Ring like doorbell camera footage of like a flaming axle or wheel going by, as on one of the rail cars on the when it was still on the rails. So that looked immediately like a hot box, so overheated bearing, overheated axle, something like that. This happens a lot. It can be caused by a whole bunch of different stuff, but usually it's some sort of mechanical failure, like internally, or the brake, like the brakes you have on your car. The brake gets stuck on the wheel, and that causes it to overheat. And eventually, if it overheats too badly, it fails, catastrophically. So that was sort of an obvious thing. Was okay, there's this failed, there's this hot box, failed bearing or something like that. And even just starting with that, you can start to peel back the layers of of how screwed up this all could be. Okay, what could cause that? Well, it could be that it was not correctly inspected or repaired or something like that at the origin, the originating terminal where the train first came from. And so it was, faulty, maybe before it even got assembled into this train that then derailed. But then, you start to take a look at that and you say, oh, well, then that's the car inspector's fault, right? But then, all of our unions and the stories started to come out about how many car inspectors and mechanical crafts in general they're under time pressure to inspect trains, inspect locomotives, inspect rail cars, repair things incredibly quickly. The quicker they can do that, the quicker they can move the cars on, and sort of dwell time, how long a car sits in a terminal without moving, is sort of one of the big metrics that the railroads use to sort of show to the shareholders and to Wall Street that they're doing a good job. So you got to keep that dwell time down. So there's all these stories about, and they were coming out after East Palestine of people sort of describing how they're under pressure at work to inspect rail cars incredibly quickly, how there's time limits, that they're only given a certain amount of time to look at each rail car, and they're being pressured into basically signing off on cars that look like they have like minor, quote unquote, minor, deficiencies, only fix really big bad stuff, right? Every railroader can tell you they've heard the phrase, if it rolled in, it'll roll out. So even then, okay, well, maybe it got missed at the originating terminal, but that's not necessarily because someone didn't do their job right. And then, then it started coming out that this train had been, since it had left its originating terminal, I think it was 3 times it had been tied down or stopped, right? And the crew had gotten off it, and it had sat, and a new crew had showed up and taken it, because sort of train crews, conductors and engineers, the people that operate the trains, were on limits for how many hours we can work, right? So, they hadn't made it. They had to tie down the train, get off the train. Someone else came and got on, and then took it. So that's 3 times of sort of the train moving, the wheels heating up, air brakes getting put on and taken off during sort of normal operations, heating up, cooling down, heating up, cooling down, sitting. Who knows? Maybe it failed en route, right? Maybe it was totally fine when it left, but because the railroads were in this crisis of not having enough crews, and because they've done things like build bigger and longer trains that don't fit where they used to, or they've removed sidings or turned double track mains into single track mains, to save money. There's that train didn't get from point A to point B very quickly, right? So you start looking at that, and maybe that could have played a factor in talking about long and heavy. That's one of the other things that we noticed is the makeup of the train was, usually you want as much of the weight as possible towards the head end of the train, because the physics of how a train works, there's slack, there's give between the cars. They run in and they run out. They're cushioned, sort of, horizontally, if that makes sense, I guess. And so that was one thing that was also noticed, was that there was a bunch of weight at the rear of the train, a lot of loads towards the rear of the train, and there were some loads to the head end of the train, but in the middle there were lighter cars. And so where the train broke apart, it actually probably made the derailment worse, because when a train breaks apart and the air brakes go into emergency, they start applying from where the break happened first, and then the air wave, I don't know, there's probably a technical term for it, travels back through the brakes and signals all the other brakes to come on. And so what happened was all the weight at the rear of the train was the stuff that was getting, the braking force last. And so it was coming into the lighter stuff that was braking first, and it was piling up and jackknifing. So yeah, I mean, all of that stuff was going through a lot of our heads. And then we heard from people who are more familiar with the territory, right? People who run these exact trains over this exact territory, that there's defect detectors along this part of the track. And so, a defect detector it's a little automated thing that, it takes temperature and, to look for hot boxes, or some of them can detect if like something's dragging under the train or whatever. Basically, if it senses something, it'll announce it on the radio frequency to let the crew know, and then they have to stop and get off and inspect the train and make sure that everything's good. And it turned out, and it sort of came out over the course of the next few days, weeks, that the defect detectors had multiple defect detectors had spotted that the temperature was rising on this one specific car, right, indicating a hot box. And it had been rising for, at a couple different places. But because the railroads basically, and defect detectors are basically, every individual railroad sets its own standards, they said, the numbers basically weren't high enough for it to trigger some sort of automatic warning. It was going to some sort of reporting center. And so it wasn't until, I think it was like the second or third hotbox detector went off, and the temperatures were clearly like catastrophically high, right? But they had been trending upwards, that the crew was notified. They did their best to stop the train. And it was while they were braking. It seems like that the thing finally gave out, and the train broke apart. So yeah, that was sort of the actual mechanics of how this went down, right? So we've got this one faulty bearing, but no matter where you look, right, you could say, okay, well, the bearing should have been fixed. Well, it's not that simple. Or the hotbox the hotbox detector should have detected it. Well, it did, but it wasn't, reported, or it wasn't, the crew wasn't notified. It didn't set off alarm bells, right? Until way too late. And then, maybe the derailment wouldn't have been as catastrophic if it had, if the train had been built better, with more weight towards the head end, less weight towards the rear. Maybe the bearing wouldn't have failed if the train had made it, in one go, instead of, having to get recrewed a whole bunch of times. So anywhere you look, there's a whole bunch of different ways that this could have gone differently, right? And so that was sort of, as the aftermath started to settle in, that was where all of the investigation, that we were doing was going, and all the discussion that we were doing was going, is that this one derailment, no matter how you look at it, it's got symptoms, right? It's got features of so much of what's wrong with the railroads in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, and you brought up quite a few things, and thank you so much for that description, because that's I think for a lot of people that have never worked on the railroad, or might not have that kind of familiarity, it's not just this one event. It's not just this, oh wow, this is a catastrophe that who could have expected it or whatever. This is the buildup of a really consistent drive by the Class 1 railroads to cut costs as much as possible in order to increase profits as much as possible. And a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about is, I mean, one of the things that you brought up is how they automatically try to is like a knee-jerk reaction, like place the blame on the railroad workers, like, oh, it's got to be their fault, like, they somebody did something wrong, and so they try to pin it all on a railroad worker or a couple railroad workers. And then the other thing is there's this concept or a scheme of precision scheduled railroading, which is essentially long trains, heavier trains, and it's completely unsafe. I think there's something like a 24-25% like higher risk of a derailment if your train's longer. And I mean, you can't really talk about the East Palestine derailment without addressing precision scheduled railroading, or PSR, or pretty shitty railroading, as I've heard it called by some railroaders. So if you want to tell folks, like, how, I guess like the two questions would be like, how often does that happen, or how much of a consistent feature of the industry is it to, one, blame the workers for any kind of mishaps, and two, just kind of like, what is precision scheduled railroading, and what are the consequences of having, other than derailments, like what's the scheme all about? What are they trying to do?
Yeah. So precision scheduled railroading, pretty shitty railroading, right? Here's where I make probably the least relatable joke of all time. But and so you can totally cut this if need be. But I remember, like, high school or something, my history teacher would say, "Oh, the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't really holy, or really Roman, or really an empire," right? PSR has always, to me, kind of felt the same way. It's not precise. It's definitely not really scheduled, and really, it's not railroading.
That's a great joke. What are you talking about?
Yeah, what am I doing? I should quit my day job. So yeah, precision scheduled railroading is basically, and it's familiar to, I mean, anybody who works in any industry, I think. I've talked to nurses, I've talked to education workers, I've talked to, other logistics workers, right? Delivery drivers, truckers. It's do more with less, right? That's the bottom line. At some point there were some mustache twirling, top hat wearing villains realized that there's a whole lot of money that you could make out of the railroads if you just did things like, reduce crew sizes, or instead of running, a whole bunch of small trains, do combine them all and do bigger trains, because then you don't need to pay for nearly as many crews, and try to stop doing individual customer and industry service, and push more towards just servicing like big hubs where sort of customers can send their trucks to come unload their stuff instead of having it delivered straight to their facility. All of it's basically, how can we cut costs, cut the workforce, skimp out on maintenance, combine trains, make them bigger and heavier, and sort of all in the name of making more money, right? So that's precision scheduled railroading in like a nutshell, right? And the problem is, and anybody who has experienced something similar, is that there's no free lunch, right? Every cut has some sort of impact, right? Some sort of trade-off. It's not just free money, right? And so, yeah, this has been sort of for the last 20, I mean, 10, 15 years, this has been sort of the guiding principles of the big class one railroads in the U.S. Is do more with less, and so we can see how sort of the East Palestine derailment is symptomatic of precision scheduled railroading. And yeah, in terms of blaming the workers, well, you got to blame somebody, right? And you can't blame, you certainly, that's the wonderful thing about trying to draw a line, and especially in sort of like the court of public opinion, where, railroading is not sort of like commonly understood, there can be a whole like, a really big train like derailed catastrophically, because the engineer, put too much brake on, and, it popped a car off the rails, and then it all went from there. Well, yeah, that's a really easy and sort of simple narrative that you can give to the media, you can give to the shareholders, but again, it sort of takes everything out of context of was this guy in his 11th hour on duty on an overnight shift that he wasn't expecting to get called for? Is he handling a train that's way bigger and way heavier than it is normally, or than it's been, even going back like 20 years ago? How much experience does this guy have? How much time on the railroad does he have? How experienced is his conductor who's working with him? Were they being, were they running under one of the automated systems that basically runs the train for you, and suddenly it threw it back to manual control, in a really bad situation? There's so much stuff, right, that can go into that, where it's, okay, maybe sort of on like some sort of really simplistic technical level, someone did something wrong. But the bigger question is, why are they being put in a situation where making, a mistake can lead to such catastrophic consequences, right? Because really, if you're operating with the safety of, everybody in mind, you need to have as many safeguards and redundancies as possible, so that, one mistake doesn't lead to catastrophe, right? And that's the big sort of one of the big underlying themes with PSR, not just on safety, but also in terms of providing sort of quality service to the shippers, and sort of fulfilling a major sort of crucial role in the economy and in the logistics network. Is there's no margins for error anymore. Everything's been cut so deep that the minute, one thing goes wrong, there's no chance of recovery, right? It all just starts cascading, whether that's a catastrophic derailment or someone getting hurt, or it's just like, I work up here in New England, or it's, hey, we just got a snowstorm and all of the switch heaters were torn out, years ago, because they didn't want to keep maintaining them. So now all the switches are frozen. And so now, a move that should take you, who knows, 2 hours. Now you're chipping away at ice and snow and trying to melt, the snow out of switch points so that you can throw them. And now it's taken 4 hours, but you're on such a tight, timetable that's completely screwed up the entire rest of your shift. And so now you're not going to get all the work done. And so they're going to have to call an extra crew to come recrew you. And that means they're not going to have a crew for another job. And it all just starts cascading, right? There's no room for error anymore. And that's sort of the big, I guess that's the big picture problem with PSR, sort of both on the safety side of things, but also on the, we want to do our jobs side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And like two things came to mind as you were talking. Like one was when I was in East Palestine for the NTSB hearings, there were a lot of questions from the folks that live in East Palestine about like, how could this happen? Like, wouldn't they have seen, somebody would have seen that, this, all this was going on with this faulty wheel bearing. They didn't see sparks or they didn't see fire and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of moments like that where you realize like people really don't understand what the railroad industry like how it works, like, or how it operates, and like things like precision scheduled railroading, where it's like, well, you've got a train that's like over a mile long, sometimes a couple miles, like, you're not going to see that, and if you aren't aware of that, then it's really an eye-opening experience to kind of hear like, oh damn, like I can't believe they're running trains that long, like, even, just as an example.
Yeah, so on the railroad, there's sort of like, there's people like me who have like less than 5 years, or close to 5 years or whatever, and then there's some pretty big generational gaps, right? And then you've got like the old head engineer who's been doing this for like 35 years and you can't believe he's still alive, and so it's weird because there's guys who were doing this back when it was all pen and paper and there were no cell phones, even radios were kind of like a newer thing, and everybody was still doing things by hand signals with lanterns, and so you'll get like these little nuggets of sort of like railroad wisdom that are slowly getting lost. But one of them was, anytime you go around a curve, you should be looking back, either through the back window of the locomotive or in the mirrors, and you should be looking back because when you go around the curve, you can see more of your train, and you should be looking to see if you can see any sparks or any smoke or anything like that, right? But like you're saying, well, when the train is 2 miles long, where's the 2 mile long curve where I'm going to be able to watch the whole thing, right? Or back in the day, we had cabooses, right? So there would be some crew up in the engines at the head end, and then there would be crew all the way at the back in the caboose, and you can smell a stuck handbrake, or you can smell a hot box. I mean, you can hear them. So what if, crazy thought, what if there had been a caboose on this train, and even if the train was even if they still weren't like close enough to be able to visually see the hot box, they probably would have smelled it, right, and gone, hold on, let's stop and check things out. But that's gone, right? The caboose is gone. It's been replaced with a little GPS marker on the rear of the train now. So it's all these things where, or like there used to be way more track guys just out and about fixing stuff, inspecting stuff. Now with so many of those jobs cut, you're way less likely to see somebody else during your 12-hour shift. What if there had been a track guy out there, or a signal maintainer, or somebody, out there doing some maintenance or something, and the train goes by and they see the hot box, right, and they call it in to the crew. I'm not saying that, there used to be a job there or something and it would have been, but there were all these ways that there were sort of like redundancies just by having more people around, right? More workers that, now that's gone. And yeah, so I think you have no idea really what's going on, 100 cars back behind you, you kind of just hope hope everything's going okay, and hope you don't get a radio call saying otherwise or something. But you have no way of knowing anymore.
Yeah, and as you're talking about, how having more workers would be beneficial, it's crazy to think. On February 4th, the FRA, this came out actually through Smart's website. The FRA is permitting self-driving freight testing despite warnings from Smart TD, your union. And so that's like a terrifying thought. It's like not only is there this sort of austerity on the railroad, like with PSR, they're even like pushing forward towards automation. And yeah, and something that I was going to bring up earlier when you were bringing up like weather conditions and ice and things like that is that in January there was another Norfolk Southern train that just derailed recently, and luckily it was just carrying soybeans. But apparently it's believed that there's freezing and thawing of the railroads, or the rails rather, were what caused the derailment. It caused them to, says, become brittle and break. So I mean, even just with like, I mean, it's just astonishing. And like I was saying, like when I was in East Palestine for that hearing with the NTSB, like people just don't really know. Like just you don't think that an industry as important as the rail industry is going to be this shitty. Like, like it's just it's wild, like the cost cutting and everything. But and we've been talking a lot about
this is the other joke I like to make. The railroad's only been around for a couple hundred years. We're still figuring it all out.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's. But we've been talking about the railroad workers side of it, which is really important, and it also in terms of the impacts of these derailments, like it also impacts these communities like East Palestine, and we saw that there was the settlement that was made that amounted to peanuts for a lot of folks that are living in East Palestine, and they're still dealing with all the contamination and all these different the impacts on their health. And there's even a new lawsuit that's coming out about 7 people that had died. And they're saying that it was a result of the East Palestine derailment. So, it's just thinking about something like East Palestine, and then the fact that, it should be something that's shocking, and it should be something that I think for a lot of people was shocking. But for folks that are hip to the railroad, or like railroad workers, I was just reading this article in kind of reading up for recording this episode. And I mean, and you can tell me what you think about this. There's this article on USA Facts that was talking about train derailments becoming more common. And this is from October 25th, 2023. It says, for the last decade, an average of 1,300 trains derailed each year, accounting for 61% of all train accidents. And since 1975, an average of 2,808 trains have derailed each year. And there was a peak year in 1978 with 9,400 derailments. But it's so these things are happening more often than people think they are. And I think like the East Palestine derailment really shook a lot of people, and rightfully so. It's terrible, but kind of the way we've been talking about, whether it's precision scheduled railroading or all the different kind of cost cutting measures that the Class 1 railroads do in order to increase profit at the expense of people that live in these communities and railroad workers, it's really more of a sort of like, well, that's a price we're willing to pay.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Like, so, and I guess in like your experience, like, I wanted to ask you about in your discussions with other railroad workers, and and whether that's in union meetings or wherever, I guess like how often are derailments discussed, or how often are how big of an issue is health and safety on the railroad, especially because like we were talking about earlier before we started recording, in 2022 it seemed like the media was really focused on the sick leave thing. Which is a big issue, but at the same time, a lot of railroad workers I've talked to said, yeah, that was one issue, but that's one of many. Like the whole system itself is in question here because of the conditions we work under. And so I'm just wondering, I guess even before the 2022 battle with the Class 1s and even before East Palestine, how do those discussions go in terms of health and safety on the railroad?
Yeah, I mean it's always a feature. I mean, so like even um since 2025 started, and this is sort of just off the top of my head, there were two maintenance away brothers who were killed um, uh, on the way to work. So they were in a van, and they got into a car accident on the way in. But then there was also uh, I think it was after the new year. There was in Texas. There was a head-on collision where there was a truck stuck on a crossing, and the train hit it head on, and both of the crew, both the conductor and engineer, were killed in the collision. Neither of them survived their injuries. So, I mean, it's always there. We're always like hearing about someone who got hurt or got killed on at work one way or another. And it's always it's always sort of, again, it's discussed as like, what did they do wrong and what should you do to protect yourself? Since in the last year or so, there's been, where I work, there's been a lot of discussion about sort of like quote unquote slow brain or fast brain, where you're sort of encouraged to slow down and think about what you're doing, and make sure that you're not rushing, and that's easy to say, right? And it's easy for the managers to say that in the job briefing at the start of the shift. But fast forward to when you're on overtime and you're trying to get it all done, and you got dispatchers worried about you're taking up their track, you've got managers worried about whether you're going to get it done, and there's all that pressure still sort of on you, right? And so nobody is saying, hey, work faster than you think you can, right? Or ignore safety. No one's saying that, right? But it's still all there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's always been, since I've been working for the railroad, it's sort of always been a thing, health and safety. And it's not just, it wasn't just the sick days, right? I mean, I mentioned train crew, where we have limits on how many hours we can work. A whole bunch of other railroad workers, different crafts, don't have limits. And so, they're pulling 16-hour doubles and things like that. And so exhaustion, right? Sleep deprivation, all that stuff builds up, cumulative health problems. But then, there's also that stuff that'll sort of kill you slowly, right? Breathing in diesel fumes, whatever else. But then there's the stuff that'll kill you quick too. And it's stuff like these derailments, accidents. I remember, I think it was a couple years ago, there was a trainee who was actually killed when some debris from a rail car that was passing their train on the track next to them came in through the windshield of the engine and killed him. And it's like, could that, that debris, that trash, whatever that was hanging off of it, could that have been spotted earlier if, car department had been properly staffed or given the actual time? Could it have been spotted earlier whenever that car was pulled out of the industry by that conductor? Who knows? So yeah, it's always been a thing. And I think, again, with the sense I had from most people that I work with, that when we all woke up and we sort of saw the news about East Palestine, there was sort of this sense of like, this could have happened to any of us. I think most of us, could think of a situation that easily could have sort of turned into that. And so it was kind of this sense of like, this has been coming for a while. And just the last thing is sort of like on the statistics of there's more and more derailments. I mean, there's sort of like obvious things that we've talked about, possible reasons for that. But the other thing is that statistic's weird, right? Because East Palestine is a derailment, right? But also like putting a single wheel set from a single car like on the ground is also technically a derailment, right? So, we've got these catastrophic derailments, but then you have all these sort of little like everyday derailments that, happen for any number of reasons that nobody ever gets hurt from, and there's not a ton of damage or whatever. And it's just like a constant, right? So it can be a little confusing to try to pick through that stuff and really be able to pull out the here's the stuff that's sort of separate the really big stuff that sort of shows you something from sort of the noise of just everyday operations, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And it's in thinking about the incidents like derailments that people don't even hear about. I was just looking at the FRA's monetary threshold notice for 2025 is $12,400. So that's the new reporting threshold for calendar year 2025. And that's kind of, you start thinking about, okay, well, wait a minute. So how many derailments are happening? How many incidents are happening that might not, chalk up to that amount of money, but nonetheless are occurring and endangering people's lives? It's funny that there's this connection of, okay, well, it has to cost this much in money, like for us to report it. But that doesn't necessarily mean just because it doesn't have as much damage, or it's not going to cost as much money to fix the problem or whatever. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous for people.
Right. Or if it's, okay, this time it didn't, cause X amount of dollars, but probably there's something that factored into that derailment that is sort of a implicit danger, right? It's something just waiting to strike, okay, this time it didn't do a ton of damage, right? But, who knows? Next time, maybe. So yeah, the derailment thing is always, and I mean, I think there is a certain degree of, okay, the railroads can never be like, I think there's a sense of like the railroads could never be like 100% safe. Like at the end of the day, you're dealing with locomotives that are, churning out, 4,400 horsepower, and you're moving cars that, when they're empty, they're, 20 tons. But there's, yeah, I do think it's possible, right? This is, it's sort of easy to hand wave it away and say, oh, the railroad's always been dangerous, it's always going to be dangerous. But I think, that can't be acceptable, right? To just say, that's how it is, not just for, sort of railroad workers, but also for everybody else who, in theory, I could quit, right? I could quit my job and say, oh, the railroad's too dangerous for me, I don't want to do it anymore, right? But the people who bought a house next to the tracks, they can't quit, right? They didn't sign up for, to have a bomb train, plow through their backyard. So it's not just about railroad workers and, oh, there's always going to be risks. It's about everybody else too.
and we've both talked to folks from East Palestine, and we've heard what they're going through and stories about, consistent nosebleeds, headaches, all these different ailments that are still, people are still afflicted with all these things that are a direct result of that derailment. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, there was that Norfolk Southern settlement that ended up resulting in, for some people, nothing, and other people's it was peanuts. And so we've got these subsequent lawsuits that are coming out that are even kind of putting the EPA and the CDC on the hot seat. And so something I wanted to talk about, especially with the time we have left, is this concept of regulatory capture, because that's something that Public Rail Now is really interested in as a concept, just because it really speaks to the overall problem that we're looking at here, where you have this major industry that's supposedly just integral to the economy as a whole, and yet somehow is allowed to operate this way, essentially regulates itself. And when you look at, like I was just thinking of, especially, as an Ohioan, I was thinking of JD Vance, who I have a special hatred for, again, as an Ohioan. But, just looking at how he went to East Palestine recently, and just was paying lip service.
We'll keep working at it. We recognize this is a long-term commitment, but we're in it for the long haul.
And it's a shame to hear folks like say that, he's going to come and he's going to, he's going to help us out and all this kind of stuff. It's really tragic. And as I was kind of digging into it, you find Occidental Petroleum, which is that's the company that manufactured the chemicals that were released in East Palestine. They ended up, again, I was just reading about this and trying to find dirt on JD Vance. Like, how are you going to go look these people in the face and act like you're going to help them out? And he's really like backpedaled on, any kind of effort to help people. He's not even going to do the, emergency declaration for East Palestine anymore. But anyway, this PAC called the Senate Leadership Fund, Occidental donated $2 million to this PAC. That PAC it put $32 million in to elect JD Vance to the Senate in Ohio. And in that election cycle, Occidental funneled $5.5 million into that committee that made it the largest corporate donor for the Senate Leadership Fund. So, that's just one example, but it's like you've got these people that are in office trying to say, oh yeah, we're going to make sure Norfolk Southern keeps their promises and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's these very companies like Norfolk Southern or like Occidental that are funneling money into the very regulatory bodies that should be regulating them. So it's like it kind of goes to the core of the system that we have, that the companies that need to be regulated or need to be, in our case, as far as the railroads are concerned, we think they should be publicly owned, that you really can't escape it in a way, like if the foxes are running the hen house. And so I guess I'm interested in hearing your perspective as a railroad worker, when you're in this kind of environment, and obviously, like, unions do a lot of work as far as, advocating for workers and, providing funds to politicians that are, worker friendly, quote unquote, I guess, like, what do you think, personally, or as like a railroader, as a union member, I guess, what can be done to kind of confront this situation that we're looking at, as far as again, like the concept of regulatory capture, that even the institutions that we should be relying on for regulating these industries that are doing all this to us, they're all connected. So what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a $1 million question right there, right? And it's funny that you're mentioning sort of foxes running the hen house and sort of like the revolving door, right? Because I think that's it's funny, even sort of dealing with like the FRA, like on like a local level or like as an individual railroader or whatever, you know, some of these guys, a lot of these guys are, you know, sort of like the field employees, like come from the craft, right? They and it's really funny when, you know, an FRA guy boards a train, and the guy sitting in the engineer's seat is someone that like he went to conductor school with like 20 years ago or something like that, right? But a lot of them are also coming from management, right? And there's not necessarily, I mean, there's some overlap, right, of management coming from the craft, but there's also a whole lot of people who are managers coming in from other industries or are recruited from other industries, you know, and or they didn't spend a lot of time sort of in the craft. You know, the current CEO of CSX is a Ford, came from Ford, where he was an executive over at Ford. But I think the like really glaring example of this right now is Trump's FRA pick is David Fink, who is most recently, he was the CEO of Pan Am Railways, which used to be called Guilford, before he sort of like bought the Pan Am like airline brand and started slapping it on his railroad. But you know, he was the last CEO of Pan Am before it got sold to CSX, in sort of like the latest example of the sort of growing monopolization of the railroads, right? The swallowing up of smaller railroads by bigger ones, sort of reinforcing the sort of monopoly that we have of, you know, these 6 big class 1 freight railroads, and sort of their shippers, their customers are basically like captive, right? They don't really have another choice. But the David Fink one is interesting in the context of East Palestine, especially because so he became his dad was the president of the company before he became president in 2006. And in March 2009, Pan Am had to pay the largest corporate criminal fine in Massachusetts history. At least that was until then. It may have been passed by now. Specifically because the company didn't report a diesel fuel spill that amounted to hundreds of gallons. So it's funny to me, sort of in the context of East Palestine, to be looking at David Fink and sort of Pan Am as sort of symptomatic of, okay, this guy has, you know, he sold his railroad to, you know, one of the big class ones, you know, but this railroad also had its own problems with environmental stuff. In the 80s, there were a couple really big strikes on that railroad over safety and a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, it's like, okay, here we've got this railroad CEO whose dad was a railroad CEO, and now, and you know, he's actively profited from the whole approval from the regulatory bodies to allow him to sell his railroad to a bigger railroad. He actively profited from that, and now he's going to be in charge of sort of one of the big regulatory bodies for our industry. So yeah, I mean, I think that sort of paints a picture, right? And I think it's not a good one. I mean, there's there's a whole bunch of stuff. The FRA put out a 2-person crew rule that there's some pretty big weaknesses and some big loopholes in it, and companies can apply for exemptions and things like that. But at least on paper, it protects the 2-person crew as standard when the railroads for the last 10 years have been really trying to push for cutting it down to just 1-person crews, greater use of remote control, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, is he gonna preside over an FRA administration that now gets to roll back that rule, go back on whatever else? I mean, I think it's tough, right? This question of what can we do, right? So I know our unions spend a lot of money on lobbying. Personally, I don't think we necessarily get a lot out of it. I mean, the various rail safety legislation that everybody and their mother was stumbling over themselves trying to propose, all of that's been stalled out, hasn't really gone anywhere, and there's now this sort of sense of, well, there's any chance of it is now gone because Trump's in. So I mean, there's lobbying, right? The unions do the lobbying. I don't think we're really seeing a return on investment for our money there. I think there's probably needs to be some sort of change in strategy on that front. And then there's sort of, I think what that leaves us is, well, if giving money to the politicians and asking the politicians isn't really helping, and we can't trust the regulatory bodies because they tend to get staffed with sort of industry insiders, right? And that's the case. That's been the case, not just when the Republicans are in, right? I mean, one thing that's worth mentioning is just because he recently passed, but one of the things that Jimmy Carter did was do some major deregulation of the railroad industry. It was funny, being that this is the Public Rail Now podcast. It was funny because after he died, I forget which magazine or industry sort of rag I was reading this in, but they were crediting him with, if he hadn't deregulated the railroads, that probably they were speculating that they would have had to have been nationalized because they were being so, they were so losing so much money due to, mismanagement and heavy-handed regulation and this, that, and the other thing. So it's interesting to sort of see, if Jimmy Carter hadn't deregulated the railroads, we might have public ownership of the railroads. I don't know to what degree like the line can directly be drawn there, but I mean, that's certainly sort of like, that's the story behind Conrail, right? And Amtrak is the railroads' private ownership didn't do its job. They ran their railroads into the ground, and the government had to step in to sort of be able to guarantee rail service, and sort of created Conrail and Amtrak. So I think but that's all a big tangent. So what does that leave us? I mean, I think it leaves us with, there's railroad workers have a lot of power in our numbers, in our negotiations. We can negotiate over work rules. We can negotiate over things like maximum train lengths and things like that. We don't just need to go to the government and regulation for that. Again, I don't know that I would say that that's being done particularly well or successfully at this point. But ultimately, we are the unions, right? Railroad workers are our unions. Our unions are, democratic organizations. We have the right to vote, to elect officers. In some cases, not necessarily directly elect officers, but we can push for our unions to do more. But I think there's also this question of sort of building up a movement, right? Building up a movement of not just railroad workers, but also shippers, passengers, people who live in trackside communities, anybody who's sort of touched by the railroads to start making demands, right? And getting clear on what sort of changes we need in order to get to a rail system that works for everybody, right? A rail system that is not operating based on whatever makes the most profit, but is operating based on the principles of we want to move goods and people as safely, quickly, efficiently as possible. Right? The idea of sort of operating it as a service rather than as something that generates profit for Wall Street investors. So, I mean, it's a big task, but I think if we start like breaking it down and start looking at things, different parts of that, what would it take? Then we start getting some sort of achievable, concrete demands that we can present to people to sort of get them on board, and that we can start organizing around. I mean, in the wake of the 2022 contract debacle, where we and again, there were so many more issues than just the sick days, right? But can't really get into that now. But where we had that contract shoved down our throat by an act of Congress and signed into law by President Biden, the most pro-labor president ever of all time.
You're a lying dog-faced pony soldier.
Right. Despite the fact that the majority of railroad workers voted it down and said it wasn't good enough and, whatever. I'm editorializing. In the wake of that, there was actually the two biggest rail unions, Smart TD and BLET. So generally speaking, these two unions represent conductors and engineers, the sort of two halves of the modern train crew. There was a joint day of action for railroad safety, and it was focused around protecting the two-man crew. And so there were demonstrations organized by the unions, in DC, and then sort of local and state level demonstrations organized by the unions. In some other places, I helped put one on in my city. And so, I think if we moved more towards that, right, and less of a asking pretty please and here's some donations for your reelection campaign, because let's be honest, the pockets of the class ones and are a lot deeper than our unions. They can give a lot more money than we can. The way that we can counteract that and balance that out is we go to the people, right? We go to the voters, if you want to call them that. We go to working class people, normal people, and we present to them this idea of it doesn't have to be this way. And we can organize, we can put the pressure on, and we can win it. And I think that's sort of, in my mind, that's the goal for Railroad Workers United in our unions, is to try and push for our unions to fight for a rail system that works for railroad workers, but for everybody else. And that's sort of the idea of the Public Rail Now campaign too. And from my perspective, at least.
It's always great talking to you, and I think that's a great place to leave off on a sort of call to action. But before we go, just wanted to give you the opportunity, if there are folks who are railroad workers or foamers or anybody that's in the labor movement that wants
rail fans, yes,
anybody that wants to get involved in Railroad Workers United, where do they go? Where should they sign up? Where should people head?
Yeah, so we have a website, and it's pretty easy. It's just railroadworkersunited.org, and then we've got accounts on all the various social media and stuff like that. But you can go to railroadworkersunited.org. You can check out sort of what we're about, and there's ways to get in contact with us there. And we're always looking for more members.
Again, that was Nick Wurst, General Secretary of Railroad Workers United and member of Smart TD Local 1473. I hope you enjoyed our first episode, and we look forward to bringing you more content like this in the future. Thanks again for listening, and please visit publicrailnow.org to learn more.